Hi everyone, Katie Montana here. Now I'm going to tell you what volcanoes are. What are volcanoes? Well, I know about these for many years now, and now it's like this. We all heard of mountains. They're like the tall ones that people actually see, and they have snow on top and stuff, like Mount Everest and there's Mount Washington and stuff. Well, volcanoes are mountains too, but they're mountains that actually blows up. And they've been around on this planet for millions of years, and I mean millions of years during the time of the dinosaurs. Now, there's a big history about these. So, when Earth was being formed, there was nothing but a lot of volcanic eruptions and there was like a lot. And after that, all the water and land were born. And then there were the first volcanoes that were on land, which is Pangea. And then new volcanoes were forming. How they were formed? Tectonic plates. And I know this in documentaries and stuff. You see, the way how volcanoes form is this. When the plates hit together, this starts to go down like that. So that's when mountains were formed. But when the water and rock starts to go down to the spot here, it forms the molten rock known as magma. And once it fills up, and then that's when the volcano starts to form and blows up. That's when they were formed. Tectonic plates, which is on land. And there are others that are formed from islands. Like the islands of Hawaii. They're all formed from volcanoes, including the big one, which has Kilauea, Mauna Loa, and the other three. And there are islands of the and same thing with the islands of Indonesia. They were all formed from islands too. Yeah. And they actually erupt around 50 to 70. The number of volcanoes, could be 50 or 70 volcanoes that erupt a year, sometimes even a bit higher. There were 90 that erupted in 2015. That was a big number for the 21st century. Yeah, and they've been going like this for millions of years. In the past, they actually over 100 volcanoes erupted during the time of the dinosaurs, non-stopped. Yeah. And now, that's how we know. And now, for the types. Let's start off with stratovolcanoes. Now, stratovolcanoes are volcanoes that has a cone shape. Of course, like Mount Fuji as an example. Mount Fuji is a cone-shaped volcano and a stratovolcano that last erupted in 1707 to 1708 of the Hohe eruption, which has been dormant for 300 years, which is a long time. Wow. And then there's Mount Mayon, another stratovolcano, and it has a nice cone shape. And when they're cone shapes, they're called perfect volcanoes because they have a nice perfect cone shape to it than any other volcanoes. There's Mount Sinabung in Sumatra. That has a cone shape to it. And there's Mount Semeru. That has a cone shape. And then there's Mount St. Helens that has a cone shape. Well, back then, but I'll talk about that some other time until May. And then there's Mount Rainier, some sort of a cone shape. And then there's Mount Adams, Mount Hood, Mount Shasta, and the rest. And then there are shield volcanoes. Like an example, Kilauea is a shield volcano in Hawaii, which is a really big crater, of course. Also, before I mention more about shield volcanoes, there are volcanoes that actually have craters where it comes out. Volcanoes that actually erupt ash and lava, of course, and so do shield volcanoes. There's one in Ethiopia where the Fantel volcano is at also, which something's been going on there, of course. So for shield volcanoes, they're volcanoes that have really big craters and they just erupt only in there with lava filling up. Like Hawaii and some of the other places that actually has shield volcanoes. And now there's submarine volcanoes. Submarine volcanoes are underwater, like the Honga Tonga Honga Ha'apai volcano from the islands of Tonga. That's a submarine volcano which erupted in 2021 to 2022 with a big eruption. And then there's another submarine volcano that's actually off the coast of Santorini, Kolumbo. Another shield volcano that last erupted in the 1600s. Which they've actually mentioned it in the documentaries about Santorini. Including the show, including the documentary series, Mega Disasters. And now, for the moment of all, supervolcanoes. Now, what are supervolcanoes? Now, we know that an actual volcano that has a nice cone shape like Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, Mount Baker, Mount Fuji, Popocatépetl, Fuego, and all of that. You see, supervolcanoes are actually hidden. You see, it's like this. Yellowstone, as an example, that erupted many eons ago. You see, Yellowstone erupted around 2.1 million years ago, which turned out to be a really big eruption, VI6, which I'll talk about, which is the volcanic explosivity index. So, when Yellowstone erupted many eons ago, it formed 3 calderas. That's what they're called, a caldera. So what happens is that when it's like this, that's what Yellowstone used to look like. The ground starts to lift up like this, and then blows up. And then after that, the ground collapsed down and formed a really big crater. And it's called a caldera. And now a caldera is a really, really big crater. Really big. And that's when everything was formed in Yellowstone. Hot springs, geysers, everything. And now there's also another supervolcano that's in Italy. Campi Flegrei, known as the Flegrarian Fields. I believe that's what it's called. Now Campi Flegrei is also another supervolcano that erupted twice and formed 2 calderas. And then after that, it formed craters in the caldera. And the most famous crater of all is Sumatra. That has nice steam vents that people check out. Now, that eruption happened many years ago too, which last erupted in 1538 with the last one. With the last crater. Let me look at... Let me take a look. So Campi Flegrei is towards Pozzuoli. And I believe the last crater was Monte Nove. Yeah, that's when it last erupted. It formed the crater Monte Nove. Yes, that's the one. So when erupt had 2 super eruptions, it formed 2 calderas and it formed the craters. And then there's other supervolcanoes that actually form 2 lakes. Like an example, Lake Toba in Sumatra. It had a super eruption around 73,000 BC, which caused everything for 10 years, and when it collapsed, it formed a caldera, and a lot of rain came in, and it formed a lake, known as Lake Toba. Same thing with Taupo in New Zealand. It formed a lake there too. Same thing, super eruptions. Now, and there's other calderas. There's the Fallas caldera in New Mexico in the U.S., and Long Valley caldera, which erupted many eons ago too. Now, for supervolcanoes, super eruptions are really rare because they don't actually erupt right away. They just erupt many years later, thousands to millions of years. The last eruption of Yellowstone was 640,000 years ago, and it's been dormant ever since. But just only magma's just getting the water going, called geothermal activity. Water, of course. Yeah. And now, for the volcanic explosivity index. Now, what is the volcanic explosivity index? Well, volcanic explosivity index, VEI for short, It actually shows the number and how high the eruption is. For 0, they don't erupt. That's how you can tell that they're dormant. Which I'm going to get onto soon. And then there's a VEI-1 eruption, which is pretty small. And then there's a VEI-2 eruption. That's pretty small. And there's the VEI-3, which is actually quite little small, but even big. And then there's 4, that's big. And then there's VEI-5, which is quite big. Like an example, there's this volcano in Indonesia called Mount Ruan, and it had a VEI-5 eruption around April of 2024, the time when, well, something I'm going to be talking about. Something about Gmod. But, yeah, it had a VEI-5 eruption and erupted twice. It erupted one time at night, which has volcanic lightning in it, and you can see lava coming out of Mount Ruan. And then on the 30th of April, when it was my friend's birthday, it erupted again. And the entire island's all covered in ash. But it's a good thing the people on there got off just in time. And then there's the VEI-6 eruption, which is quite big and dangerous. Now, for that eruption, like an example, the Krakatoa volcano in 1883, it had a VEI-6 eruption that caused tsunamis, which I'll talk about soon. Now, that one was really big and it caused the climate change there. And then same thing with Mount Pinatubo in 1991. That one had a VEI-6 eruption and that one was big too. And then there's the VEI-7 eruption, which is really big. Now that one is actually deadly, like the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, and that eruption was really big, and the entire cone was blown off. And 1816 was known as the year without a summer, which caused everything from Africa and Europe and North America to be covered with snow. And there's also the eruption of the Santorini volcano that had a VEI-7 eruption many years ago, which was catastrophic. Yeah. And now the VEI-8, which turned out to be a really big number and turned out to be the biggest eruptions of all. Like the supervolcanoes that actually has those eruptions. Yellowstone and also Toba and everything. And then, but the biggest volcanic eruption of all was Lake in Colorado, which turned out to be, that has the most biggest super eruption ever on Earth, many eons ago. And that's when everything with Colorado was being formed, of course. So yeah, that's the volcanic explosivity index. And now, the ones that are active and dormant and extinct. Now, for example, let's start off with the active ones, and mostly active. So, starting off with active volcanoes. Active volcanoes are the ones that are getting ready to erupt throughout the times. Like Popocatépetl, that's active, and Fuego in Guatemala, and Santa Maria, and Kilauea, and Sakurajima. They're active, of course. And most active are actually like volcanoes that actually erupt more. Like I mentioned before, like Sakurajima, Fuego, and the rest. And there's also Mount Stromboli and Mount Etna that erupted. Hit a whole lot throughout months in a year. Yeah, those two actually erupted throughout so many years since the Roman years. Of course. And there's others that are mostly active too that I can't name of. And now for dormant volcanoes. Dormant volcanoes are volcanoes that are sleeping for like decades and centuries and millenniums, and they won't erupt anytime soon. Like an example, Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier had an eruption around the 1400s and sat dormant for 400 years and then erupted again in 1894 and sat dormant for over a century, which is a long time. Mount Adams in Washington State. That's been dormant for thousands of years. Mount Fuji, 300 years, which is a long time. And then there's Mount Kilimanjaro that's been dormant for millenniums too. Mount Vesuvius, That's been dormant for 80 years since it last erupted it in 1994. Plus, that volcano actually had a history of an eruption of the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 AD, which is really sad. Of course, that one had a VEI 5 eruption, but mostly goes with VEI 3 eruptions. It's big, but probably a little deadly. And there's also the, let's see. There's Mount Shasta, that's been dormant, and same thing with Mount Hood, of course. And there's Mount Edgecumbe, of course. And supervolcanoes that's laid dormant for many years, like Long Valley Caldera's been dormant since the magma is cooling. And Yellowstone's been dormant. Fias Caldera's been dormant. Yeah, a lot of supervolcanoes have been dormant. But don't even mention anything about that in the comments, or I'm gonna have to report you. I don't like that because my nerves gets triggered on that. And now for the extinct volcanoes. Extinct volcanoes are volcanoes that are only erupted once and they'll never erupt again. Like an example, Lake Itra, the supervolcano that erupted many eons ago that formed Colorado, that's been extinct for millions of years. So when they're extinct, that means they can't erupt again anymore. And then there's Molehill in Virginia. That's been extinct for millions of years too. Now, I bet there might be other volcanoes. Now, I believe there's other volcanoes that are extinct. There's Olympus Mons on Mars, which is the biggest volcano in the solar system that's been extinct. And then, yep, Lake Itra caldera. And there's Doshi Hill. And then there's Mount Mayon. I believe it's hard to pronounce it, but yeah. There's a bunch of extinct volcanoes out there that you can actually see. And I think they might be safe to be climbed on and stuff since they're not erupting anymore, but yeah. So yeah, this is the thing about volcanoes and what they are. But here's the thing, to all of you people out there who hike up on volcanoes, hear this. Be very careful when you start to hike up on volcanoes, like Mount Fuji in the summer and Mount Rainier and some others. Because, first off, the snow, because avalanche stuff, and you can't tell they're going to erupt. Because that time in 2023, some people hiked up Mount Merapi in Indonesia, and some were injured and some died when erupt. They didn't even see it coming. So that's the lesson to all of you hikers. Do not hike up a volcano when they're about to erupt. Sure, you can actually hike up on Popocatépetl and see the smoking crater, but be careful when you reach to the very top of Popocatépetl. And people who hike up to Fuego volcano, be careful on that too. Be careful when you hike up on volcanoes, because you can't tell that they're gonna erupt. So please be careful. So that's about it. Be sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the like, send some comments, and hit the bell button for brand new videos, and I'll see you next time. Sorry about that. Just the sound of things of the people on Facebook. Hey, let me try again. Be sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the like, send some comments, and hit the bell button for brand new videos, and I'll see you next time. Peace out, everyone.